And we are delighted to welcome Elyzabeth Gaumer, the Acting Assistant Commissioner for Research and Evaluation from the Department of Housing and Development. Thank you so much, and we apologize for the short delay.
No, that's quite all right. I'm just going to grab some water.
Oh.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Yep. Perfect. Hi, guys. So good morning, Chairman Godso and members of the Rent Guidelines Board. I am Elyzabeth Gaumer. I am currently Acting Assistant Commissioner for Research and Evaluation at the New York City Department of Housing, Preservation, and Development. I'm very pleased to be here today, again this year. I'm going to share some of the recent work that HPD has been involved in and also present some of our initial select findings from the 2014 Housing and Vacancy Survey, the HVS. So I'd like to start by providing an update on the Mayor's housing plan, HNY, or Housing New York. So as you know, this is an ambitious 10-year, 5-borough plan to create or preserve 200,000 units of affordable housing. During calendar year 2014, the city financed the creation and preservation of 17,376 units toward that goal. We are working in all 5 boroughs with about 5,500 units in the Bronx, 5,000 units in each of Brooklyn and Manhattan, 1,000 units financed in Queens, and 600 units financed in Staten Island. The majority of these units, about 12,000 in total, are targeted to low-income households. That's those households earning at or below 80% of HUD income limits. With just over 11,000 units preserved and just over 6,000 units of new construction, we exceeded our first year's projections by more than 1,300 affordable units. We're obviously very proud of that. It took a lot of effort. Based on the average household size, the units produced and preserved in this first year are enough to house nearly 42,000 New Yorkers. Our targets for fiscal year 15 are just under 6,000 units of new construction and just over 10,000 units that will be preserved. As you know, we do not only exclusively focus on housing production and preservation. Several HPD programs specifically work on the identification and improvement of our city's distressed housing stock, which has long been a priority of HPD and the city municipal agencies as a whole. One of these programs is HPD's Alternative Enforcement Program, or AEP, and the Proactive Preservation Initiative, or PPI. You know, the city loves its acronyms. These programs focus on the identification and remediation of troubled buildings to ensure that poor building conditions are addressed and to prevent this important housing stock from falling into disrepair and ultimately abandonment. At the beginning of each year, HPD designates severely distressed multiple dwellings for participation in the AEP program. Buildings are selected for participation based on their class, hazardous or immediately hazardous violations, and the amount of emergency repair charges incurred as a result of the work performed by HPD on behalf of the owners. Prior to the current round, HPD designated up to 200 buildings a year for the program. Beginning with round 8, HPD will designate 250 buildings. Round 8 buildings were selected on February 2nd of this year. Round 8 consists of 250 buildings that comprise 3,473 units. The full list of buildings that are included in Round 8 are posted on our website and are therefore publicly available. As of March 4th, there are 450 total buildings comprising 3,656 units that are still active from rounds 1 through 7. These are actively being monitored by AEP, and of course HPD is working with owners to try to improve those buildings. And those are in addition to the Round 8 buildings just recently identified. The Proactive Preservation Initiative, PPI, was started in 2011. It was a strategy designed to allow nonprofit and legal services and elected officials at a direct, non-data-driven method for engaging HPD and its enforcement arm. In calendar year 2014, 468 buildings had an initial survey conducted by HPD's Division of Neighborhood Preservation. This is our intake process. In addition, over 40% of those buildings were identified for follow-up inspection, where we could really engage over time. It also included strategies of litigation and ongoing intensive monitoring. Since its inception, back in 2011, 67% of the buildings selected have reduced the number of outstanding B and C class violations that are currently open. Approximately a quarter of all buildings referred for the program have come from external sources and our community partners, including electeds. In addition to these already existing programs, HPD and HDC are launching 2 new programs this year as part of the One City Built to Last initiative. HPD worked closely with the Mayor's Office of Sustainability on this new initiative to craft a strategy that would help improve the quality for private owners undertaking energy efficiency and water conservation improvements in their buildings. Currently, buildings undergoing a substantial rehabilitation or being financed by LIHTC, low-income housing tax credit, are required to meet enterprise green community standards. This is part of our ongoing commitment to green and sustainable construction and rehabilitation practices. This requires that they integrate basic energy and water efficiency measures as part of a rehabilitation. All of our affordable housing new construction programs also must meet these same requirements. However, the hundreds of moderate rehab projects financed by HPD and HDC each year in multifamily buildings of all sizes do not currently meet those same standards. The city will begin by requiring a green capital needs assessment for moderate rehab projects so that opportunities to improve energy and water usage are included within the building's capital needs. This will allow cost-effective energy and water efficiency improvements to be integrated into the scope of rehab work, which could reduce energy usage by as much as 10 to 20% for these properties. And that's obviously important not just to help improve and continue to green our city, but also, of course, to reduce the costs for owners of increased utility costs. Additionally, HPD is developing an affordable housing loan program, and that's an evaporating or low interest loan program, which will assist owners of small and mid-sized multifamily properties to implement energy and water efficiency improvements in exchange for entering into affordable housing regulatory agreements. So this new program will target small to mid-sized multifamily properties, probably 5 to 50 units, with low and moderate income households that have above average energy and water consumption. They may also have rehab needs, so this is naturally an opportunity to couple those. And this is particularly important, and we're targeting this in areas where there's a danger of losing affordability due to upward market pressures and/or rising utility costs. In addition to supporting owners by providing opportunities for assistance in maintaining their buildings, HPD is committed to supporting tenants so that they can remain in their homes. In February's State of the City address, Mayor de Blasio announced an initiative to invest $36 million in legal services for tenants in newly rezoned neighborhoods as part of the Housing New York plan. The program will help residents fight harassment by landlords who may be eager to harass and evict tenants to take advantage of higher rents that often accompany a rezoning. In addition, the new Tenant Harassment Prevention Task Force was created to investigate and bring enforcement actions, including criminal charges, against landlords who harass tenants. The task force is a collaboration of the Office of the New York State Attorney General, the New York State Homes and Community Renewal, and city agencies including HPD, Department of Buildings, Department of Health and Mental Hygiene, and the New York City Law Department. The task force aims to coordinate city and state agencies and the AG's office on joint inspections, enforcement actions, and litigation strategies to intervene in buildings where harassment may be occurring in order to intervene before tenants are forced out. The task force will look at complaints filed with city agencies about conditions constituting harassment, among other data, as needed, and as needed may conduct joint inspections, which are ongoing. We are also able to issue violations and orders and initiate additional enforcement action with the AG's office, the district attorney's office, and HCR's TPU, Tenant Protection Unit, as needed. As I'm sure you all know, HPD conducts a triennial survey known as the Housing and Vacancy Survey. We've done this every 3 years since 1965. This is the 50th year of the HVS, just a remarkable milestone. And so I'm happy today to share some initial findings. Today I'm only going to walk through some very high-level findings, but of course you have received our set of initial select findings with more detailed tables, and to the extent that there are other data or information that would be useful, we're happy to prepare that for you. I'm going to try to coordinate this. The Housing and Vacancy Survey is used to determine, among other things, the rental vacancy rate, legally mandated through the Emergency Tenant Protection Act of 1974. We also investigate and collect reliable data on the supply of housing, its condition and affordability, demographics of tenants, and as you know, the HVS is in fact the only complete source of information on rent-stabilized tenants in New York City, and the need for continued rent regulation more broadly. Its methodology has remained consistent over time with only minor changes to improve validity. It's conducted by the United States Census Bureau at the request of the City of New York. Interviews for the current survey were conducted between February and June 2014, making it the most up-to-date representative data on New York City currently available. So today I'm going to share some key statistics on the current state of overall housing in New York, as well as some very high-level details on rent-stabilized tenants in particular. So the 2014 Housing and Vacancy Survey reports the vacancy rate in rental apartments in New York City, and that 2014, the net rental vacancy rate was 3.45% citywide. That's well below the 5% vacancy rate threshold set forth in state and local laws as the condition for determining a current state of housing emergency. Further examination of this 3.45% vacancy rate for available rental units shows that those units with an asking rent of $800 to $999 was 3.73%, while the rate for units with an asking rent of $2,500 or more was 7.32%. So this is, again, this is citywide by rent level. If we look at the overall net rental vacancy rate only for rent-stabilized units, it was 2.12%, so significantly lower than the overall citywide. It's important to note that the HVS estimated the total number of residential units citywide at more than 3.4 million for 2014. That's the largest housing stock since we began measuring that. The low vacancy rate here of 3.45%, despite this record-breaking housing stock number, indicates that although supply has, of course, continued to increase, that it has failed to keep pace with continued demand. In 2014, the HVS showed that the overall housing quality in New York City continues to be very strong. However, there are areas of the city where housing quality lags. This map shows the prevalence of rental units where the current occupant reported 3 or more of the 7 maintenance deficiencies about which we ask. And the HVS data underscore the need for our continued commitment and collaboration for improving living conditions for all New Yorkers. The HVS collects detailed information on demographics, particularly household incomes and rent levels, that we use to assess rent burden of residents and the need for affordable housing. In 2014, the median contract rent was $1,200. The median gross rent, which accounts for utility costs and is therefore a better, more complete measure of rent, was $1,325. That's citywide. A household would have to earn $53,000 a year to be able to afford the typical apartment in New York City in 2014. However, the HVS data show that the median household income citywide was $50,400, not $53,000. and that among renters, it was $41,500. So there's a huge disparity between incomes and, of course, rents. Within the rent-stabilized stock, in comparison, the median gross rent was $1,300, which means that a household would have to earn $52,000 to afford the typical unit, rent-stabilized unit in New York City in 2014, but that the median household income of stabilized tenants was only $40,600. Not surprising, in 2014, that means there were high levels and higher levels of rent burden than we've seen in previous waves of the HVS. In 2014, 56% of renter-occupied households were rent burdened or paying more than 30% of their monthly income toward housing costs. 33.5% were severely burdened or paying more than half of their income toward rent. As one might expect, as this graph shows, this burden is not evenly distributed across all income groups. When we look at the distribution of renter-occupied households by HUD income limits, this is a way of categorizing household income that adjusts for household size, and it is the way that HPD and other housing agencies classify eligibility for affordable housing. We see that households in the lowest income groups are disproportionately burdened. And it's perhaps a little difficult to see up there, but the lowest income groups are, of course, nearly all severely burdened, and where they are not burdened, the gray above, is largely because of access to existing affordable housing and subsidized housing programs. And that we see in low income, largely the low income working population, sort of 40 to 80% of income limits, that there's a disproportionate need for affordable housing. They're not severely burdened, but they are paying more in housing than they should. And of course, those households are less likely to qualify for other forms of means-tested housing or other types of social safety net benefits. In 2014, the HVS estimated that there were 1,029,918 units, or 47.2% of rental units that were rent stabilized. Of course, you know that there is no single best source of information on which units are subject to rent stabilization. The HVS combines multiple sources to produce the most complete and reliable estimate, so we're at just over 1 million units in 2014. That's statistically about exactly the same as it was in 2011. So we see no net change over time in the total rent stabilized stock. Of course, we have rent-stabilized units throughout the city. This map shows the number of rent-stabilized units that the HVS estimates by subborough area, which is a close proxy for a community district. And there is a large number of rent-stabilized stock, in fact, throughout most neighborhoods of Manhattan, the Bronx, Queens, and Brooklyn. In 2014, there were an estimated 850,000 private non-regulated units. This is what's typically referred to as market. And what I wanted to do today was just make some very simple comparisons between these two major types of housing stock, rent stabilized on the one hand and private non-regulated on the other. I hope you guys can read those numbers. So it's important to note this is not a comparison of the entire housing stock. This is just these two groups. So we're not looking at public housing, other forms of federally regulated housing. This is just these two major groups, which are frequently talked about in the media and obviously are the source of analysis for other work that RGB is doing. So compared to private non-regulated households, fewer rent-stabilized households are headed by white non-Hispanic and are more likely to have at least one senior living in the home. These are characteristics that are important for us to understand in terms of vulnerability and advantage. In 2014, private non-regulated units typically rented for significantly more than rent-stabilized units. The median monthly gross rent for these market units was $1,625, so that's the 50th percentile, as opposed to $1,300 for rent-stabilized. And this is, again, regardless of the income of the tenants or the geography. A higher proportion of rent-stabilized tenants were rent-burdened and also severely rent-burdened compared to market tenants. 56% of stabilized tenants were rent-burdened and 34% were severely burdened in 2014. This is compared to 50% and 28% respectively for market tenants. Median household income of rent-stabilized tenants is also substantially lower than that of private, non-regulated renters. And more rent-stabilized tenants are considered low income, as defined by HUD income limits. And that's, of course, the targeted group that HPD focuses on so intently. Thank you for the opportunity. I know these are very high levels. I'm happy to take any questions, and I'm also, to the extent that this is helpful, we're happy to provide additional support with follow-ups as well.
Thank you so much. Questions from the board?
Could you send us your written, what you just read off?
Absolutely,
and
along with the
these
slides, sure.
Yeah.
The slides would be great.
Yeah. I also wanted to know, do you know the dollar amount of what 80% of the HUD guidelines are?
I should know that, but I don't know it off the top of my head. But I'm happy to send that as well with the actual dollar figures. Yeah, of course.
I have one other question. Do you have this selected initial findings is great. Do you have the previous one? I know it may be comparing apples and oranges, but it'd be interesting to see certain trends.
Sure, I'd be happy to provide the 2011 initial select findings. One thing that I should note, we have worked obviously over a very long time frame to try to get the most reliable and most valid estimates for all of our measures, but particularly for understanding which stock is actually subject to rent stabilization. For 2014, we made some minor improvements to our methodology for that, working closely with the Census Bureau. And so some of it is in fact more apples to oranges than it would otherwise be, but we're also happy to rerun 2011 numbers where you really want to see apples to apples, wherever that's helpful.
That'd be very helpful, thank you.
So it looks like in the tables of the back of the report, you do have comparisons between 2011 and 2012.
For some of those measures, we do.
The tables in the back, you've read on the 2011?
Yes, those are for consistent apples to apples comparisons.
All right. Leads me to two questions you're going to love. When is the file going to be available to the public?
So we're working obviously very hard with the census to be able to release microdata. This is obviously, we do this each wave. It's important for RGB's own internal work, but it's obviously very important for many groups throughout the city to do detailed analysis, and we do have renewal of rent laws coming in June. We hope that we will have it in the next month or so, but I'm certainly willing to keep in close contact and let you know the actual date.
Which leads me to the next question. The file for 2011, are they going back and doing that file as well?
So they are not going to revise the rent regulation status for the 2011 file.
They're not?
They are not going to do that. There are, at least currently, no intention to do that. But to the extent that there are key measures, we will be producing those internally at HPD and making those available. And as always, with any of the data, we're happy to do custom tabulations, not just for RGB, but also for other stakeholders.
Hi. Just a couple of quick questions. The affordable housing, really commend the administration on the work they've done. You raised the issue of affordability being at 80% of AMI and lower. I know we've heard a lot of concerns about AMI being such a high number, especially in a lot of communities, especially when the income in those communities, 80% of AMI could be a family, could be $55,000. As we know, the income in most of these rent-stabilized communities are much lower. I'm wondering how much of those units are at lower, like at 30% of AMI, versus at a higher number at 80% of AMI.
Sure. So I am happy to follow up with this first calendar year's production numbers by affordability. Okay. But broadly speaking, this administration, of course, and the housing plan are very focused on trying to meet the needs of all New Yorkers. So that includes those above 80% as well, moderate and middle. In total, I think there's 20% that will be dedicated to moderate and middle income households. But it also means that we're skewing much deeper than we have in previous administrations, and also doing our best to really create new term sheets, new programs, new incentives for reaching those extremely low income households or those earning earning below 30.
That's great to hear, thank you. Just a couple other questions. Great work on AEP and proactive enforcement. Didn't hear anything about third-party transfer program. I'm wondering where things are with that.
So of course, third-party transfer is an important program. We're working on a new round of TPTs. That's still in the works, but if you're interested, I'm happy to get more details and provide them to you guys.
That would be great.
Sure.
And part of the enforcement tools that HPD has is around 7A proceedings, which are affirmative proceedings they bring on behalf of tenants and buildings where severe building conditions. I'm wondering what the status of 7A proceedings that HPD has been involved in, as well as heat cases that HPD's brought over the past year.
Sure. So 7A along with TPT, those two programs sort of go hand in hand. And 7A is, of course, a very important tool that we have to work with the most distressed landlords and owners that are less cooperative or not as present as others who are just have limited means and unable to be able to take care of. So I'm happy to send 7A numbers as well as TPT as a follow-up. Heat season, of course, we all know that this has been a very cold winter. I think actually, correct me if I'm wrong, this was the coldest February since, I think, 1934. I think that's right. It's obviously, our code enforcement has been very busy this year. I have some of the numbers here on heat and hot water complaints. So for this past year, the total complaints received through 311 for heat, for lack of heat, and hot water was almost 89,000 this year. Wow. So that's since October 1st. That's obviously a disproportionately high number, but of course makes sense given the weather conditions. And total violations that have been issued again since October 1st when heat season began are just under 3,800.
Do you know how that compared to last year?
I don't have the numbers before. Oh, I can say that the heat complaints overall are up 9.6% from last year, but I can happily provide numbers if you want them.
And the last thing is, on at least the handout that we got, it was there's not, the pages are, it's page 6, it's number 12 on page 6, talks about the data on the rent and regulated units, and I was surprised that the percentage of rents that are $1,500 or more. So is based on what you're saying here, so I'm clear, you're saying that 2/5 are 1,500 or more and 1/5 is over 2,000. So 3/5 of all rent stabilized units are renting for over $1,500 or more?
So this item that you point to in the initial select findings is all rental units, not rent stabilized.
Okay.
But of course, the rental distribution or the distribution of rental units by price has continued to move to the right over time as prices have gone up.
And I'm wondering, you had a great chart up before about availability of vacant apartments at different rental levels. Do you have that for just rent stabilized units as well?
Or we can send that along.
That would be very helpful, thank you.
The overall vacancy rate for rent stabilized units is 2.12%.
But it's interesting to see how many are at
course.
2,000 versus 800.
Of course.
Thank you.
I have a quick question about the number of rent-stabilized units. You said this sort of stayed the same since 2011, and I'm wondering if that has something to do with the new housing that has been developed that is rent-stabilized, but is rent-stabilized at a way larger dollar amount than the current stock that we have, or the older stock. And so although we have the same amount of rent-stabilized units, a large portion of them, at least the new ones, are at not the average rent-stabilized units that were constructed a while back. And I wanted to see if you had any input or any ideas, or if that analysis is correct.
Sure. So that's an important point and question. I'm sure that Andrew and his team will be talking in detail about this with changes to the rent-stabilized stock report, I'm sure forthcoming.
Yeah, I mean, we were able to, break down the rent for newly created stabilized apartments, and that's in the report. So versus, so you can compare that to the median rent of the all stabilized.
What I will say is this, so the HVS is a complement to other analyses of the rent stabilized stock. What we focus on for that particular survey is net changes over a very long time frame. So that 1,029,000 number, which is within the margin of error from what it was estimated to be back in 2011, means there's no net change. So the number of units that have exited stabilization is about the same as those that have been added through various programs. But as you note, what has been added is a combination of affordable housing units, which are probably lower than the typical rent for other stabilized units. But it also includes units that are added through tax programs, including J51 and 421A, and that we know that those legal rents are typically much higher.
I was also interested in hearing you guys in the vacancy, in talking about the housing plan for the administration. You didn't mention the rezonings that are going to be taking place, and I was wondering of what kind of housing are they building? Is it going to be rent stabilized? At what rate, dollar amount is it going to be? And then how is that in correlation with the actual income of the areas where you're building?
Sure. So obviously there has been a paradigm shift, I think, for this administration relative to previous ways of thinking about housing investment, and a much deeper recognition that when we're working with communities on affordable housing, that we need to really be focused on actually the needs of communities themselves, and recognizing that investments in affordable housing done to scale in certain areas are actually really investing in neighborhoods, and is not just bricks and mortar, one building at a time. So there are a couple of things that have already transpired and are underway that I think are worth noting. One is at HPD, the creation of the Office of Neighborhood Strategies with a new Deputy Commissioner, Daniel Hernandez, and his team has been working very closely with other agencies, but in particular with communities, to try to understand actually what the needs are on the ground and be able to develop a preservation strategy in concert with rezonings. I mentioned in my remarks the dedication of resources for tenant legal services in those rezonings, and I think that's a really important part of this. But in general, there has been a lot of focus on working with community groups to understand not only current needs and how we can support those, but to really, in the rezoned areas, to be able to do that so that we're investing in those communities.
Just to make a quick comment, so it's really great that all this money has been allocated and protecting and preserving the current stock that's there. But I also feel like when we talk about rezoning, the rezoning actually affects a larger portion of the area that's being studied or ends up getting rezoned. And so when we talk about this money going in, it's going to very specific zip codes that might not include the zip codes that might, sort of say, hey, well, if they're rezoning this and this is what they're going to be able to charge, it's going to spread outward, not inward. And so, it sort of excludes a whole portion of tenants who might be facing harassment, illegal overcharges, and other things that we've seen as a trend.
The one thing that I'll add to that, I think that's a very welcome and important comment. Our Office of Neighborhood Strategies, including actually our research and evaluation unit, when we do needs analysis and develop our affordable housing strategies, not just in rezoned areas, but in fact citywide, that we really are focusing on not only sort of study areas that are actually part of a rezoning, but we do in fact focus on a much broader swath because we understand the interconnection among all of these things. So.
Just a quick question, sorry, Dave, but I know you mentioned the rezonings. I'm wondering whether the administration is on their mandatory inclusionary zoning policy. I know this is something that they've talked about, and I know HPD is looking at trying to release the policy. I'm wondering where you are and the timing of it in relationship to these rezonings.
So there's been a very broad interagency collaboration for the last many months working on a variety of policies, including inclusionary zoning. Those details are not yet fully fleshed out, but they are, I expect, will be released soon. And that certainly is one of many tools that we'll be using not only in these communities, but across the city to be able to really increase the volume of affordable housing.
Any questions?
I have one.
Yeah,
Oh, go ahead.
okay. Thank you. So on page 7, you mentioned that households in rent stabilized units as a whole, in the city, they pay 36% of their income towards the rent in 2014. But isn't it 31% of the gross income for the rent stabilized that they're supposed to be paying for rent?
So
The ratio is looks a little bit higher here.
So rent-stabilized units are not means-tested, right? So the rents are not set based on the incomes of the tenants unless those rent-stabilized units are also part of an additional subsidized housing program, for example, or if the tenant has a housing choice voucher or something like that. So what we're measuring here is across all rent-stabilized tenants, what the median rent-to-income ratio is for particular parts of the housing stock. Did that answer your question?
Yeah.
And a follow-up to that, if you were to take out some of those folks who are getting those programs, like Section 8, I know how they're reported in the HVS is 100% of their income often is put toward rent. Would that lower or increase that percentage?
It would increase it pretty dramatically. We also, for not this particular report, but many of our analyses, we try to focus on households that are not living with other forms of rental assistance. And overall, we see it's actually a higher proportion of rent burdened if we exclude those. It's somewhat counterintuitive. Some of the households in means-tested housing report in the HVS that they're paying all of their income toward rent, or a very high proportion of it, but it also, a larger number, it skews those statistics downward because so many are paying exactly 30% of their income toward rent. And so when we exclude them and look at really the private world of housing, that rent burden is in fact even higher.
And so will that be sort of delineated and made express in any of the reports? Is that possible?
Sure, I can send those to you.
That would be really helpful.
Yeah,
Actually,
sure.
I'm sure if I followed. So if, for the rent stabilized number, so that 33.1%, if you took, say, Section 8 tenants out of that figure, you're saying that the 33% would go higher?
That's right.
And do you have those data could you take out the 421A units that are at market when they first got into rent regulation? Is there any way to exclude those? Because they may be skewing the number down if someone's making $250,000 and they're paying $4,500 or something.
So, yes, that's a very good point. Unfortunately, the HVS, while we use 421A data, among other information, to identify stabilized units, it's not a complete measured variable in our data set, so excluding them likely would only exclude some portion of them. We just can't do a reliable estimate.
I just quick question, actually just kind of going back to this. I thought that one of the charts actually had you normalized for Section 8. I'm assuming that also, did that also include SCRE and DRE as well?
So the graph that I showed with rent burden does exclude public housing and vouchers.
Okay.
And we have some of that cut in many different ways. We don't exclude SCRE and DRE.
Okay.
Typically, because those households are by definition receiving housing assistance, but they have to be rent burdened in order to qualify. And so it's a little bit of a difficult type of rental assistance to either exclude or include. But we're happy to provide additional numbers if that would be useful.
But I think your chart normalizes, Andrew, for, if I read it correctly, it did normalize for the Section 8, so that at least you're...
It excludes public housing in
Right.
Section 8.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the numbers, I'm looking forward to getting your presentation, but I'd love to just dig in a little bit more, I think as we all would, about the rent burden when you pull out, because I'm still trying to figure out the math in my head too about how.
Sure. We'll send the numbers both
Okay,
ways so that
thank
you guys
you.
can really also see it.
And then actually a favor to ask you. I had the pleasure to hear Daniel speak actually in an affordable housing panel yesterday, 2 days ago. And it was interesting, the mandate of, it's neighborhood strategies, is that what it's called? That division, and his team is basically like a mini rent guidelines board. Because he is going in and thinking about, I call it boots on the ground, the people in the communities. So rather than sort of taking it from just an abstract, city hall, coming from a removed place, determining neighborhood and rezoning and those types of policies, they're actually going into the communities, finding out who the tenants are, but they're also working with the owners of the buildings. So I likened him to a little rent guidelines board. We would love to have him come and speak, if you would be okay with sharing his time, to have an opportunity to pepper him with questions on what he's seeing as he's going through they called it the speed dating of owners, and also getting to know the community members and the tenants, because I feel like he faces a lot of the same challenges that we do on the rent guidelines board in figuring out the right balance between all the constituents.
Sure, I'm sure Daniel would love to come and talk to you guys.
Can I also say, along the rezonings, what community, I wish that we could define what community organizations and community members is more in the rezoning, because I work in a community that's being studied to get rezoned, and we have not been approached in the way that I think it's community member led and all of the stuff that I think you guys have highlighted as wanting to do. So I would love to have, pick his brains and, get some ideas of how we can do that better.
Great.
Thank you so much for your time and for this incredibly interesting information and all this future information you'll be sending us. Thank you.
Of course. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And happy rent season.
Okay, any other business to discuss before we adjourn?
What's the next meeting?
April 2nd.
A quick question about the emails. So are we going to be collecting emails only at the public testimony hearings, or once people sign up, we're just going to be continuously updating for like the next hearing? Anyone who's here and signs up would get an email?
Our email is done through nyc.gov, but
Okay.
you can link to our site to get there. So at any point, people can sign up by just going to our website, but at every meeting, we're going to have these green slips for people who come to our meeting. But you can just go simply to the website. In fact, when we put it up, we had 630 people who already signed up without even having a meeting. So
There was a great need for it.
if they go to the nyc.gov, we're listed there before we even place it on our website. So I would imagine that will go up quite a bit because it's now on our website that links there. So, but it will be at all the meetings as well.
So can I also ask, when we get the information that we're collecting or questions that we're going to HPD, I'd love to know what the budget connected to these issues are. Like if they have this great anti-harassment task force, what's the budget for that?
You're very welcome. Back up a little bit from the...
So yeah, we've heard a lot of great information from HPD about new initiatives. It'd be great to get the budget connection to how much money are they spending, how much are the agency resources going to this work versus that work. It'd be great to get that information as well from HPD as we get.
Any of the new folks? Wait till that student ask your questions, more data. All right, thanks everyone so much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you, everyone.
Oh, I'm sorry, can someone make a motion to adjourn, please?
Make a motion to adjourn the meeting.
Second?
All in favor?